Hardcore punk rock and hip hop are not two genres which, on the surface at least, would appear to have much relevance or commonality to one another. They're both practiced by different cultural groups, different socio-economic groups, and they speak to issues which are quite specific to those groups of individuals. Musically also, hip-hop is a predominantly electronic form of music derived from African-American culturally important music, whereas punk rock is a more classic westernized physical instrumentation rock band type situation. It is, however, my hypothesis that as we scratch at this surface level, we may find similarities which run far deeper, such as the fact that both are forms of protest music, both are deeply independent in root and in practice, and both speak the voice of that marginalized community that practices them in a way that wider society may not wish for that voice to be spoken. To explore the similarities and indeed the differences between these two genres, I'm going to be taking a look at two incredibly important forms of those musics. So nowhere is the similarities, at least, more illuminated than in New York hip-hop and New York punk rock specifically, as both are practiced by individuals which are deeply failed by the system in some way, shape or form. So they're dealing with quite similar issues of poverty and dealing with similar issues of brutality and violence and drug dealing as a daily occurrence in life. So the two albums that we're going to be taking a look at in this video will be Nas's Illmatic from 1994 and the Cro-Mags' Age of Quarrel from 1986. It's very difficult for us to understand just how impactful a piece of work may be to a genre if we don't have a foundational knowledge of how the genre came to be, and indeed why a piece of work might be relevant. So beginning with New York hardcore. So New York hardcore, of course, comes from its parent genre being punk rock, which can actually, even though most people consider it British, it can really trace its roots back to New York, to the late 60s and the early 70s, to the proto-punk bands who have a kind of an archetypal raw garage type approach. We're talking bands like the Stooges, the Velvet Underground and the New York Dolls. So these groups would take the rock and roll archetype of the day and make it more rugged, make it more visceral, make it more simple. And this of course set the foundations for punk rock to take root both in America and over in the UK as well. Initially, American hardcore could be considered more of a West Coast development of American punk rock. Middle-class kids dealing with the American dream, the American aspects and ideals of suburbia and the nuclear family, rebelling against that, taking the archetype of punk rock that was developed by bands like the Stooges and the New York Dolls and making it more dangerous, faster, more aggressive, more macho in many ways, and significantly more visceral. The idea being that they wanted to reclaim the danger of punk rock's initial ideal, which to many of them felt as though the edges were kind of smoothed off a little bit as punk rock became more of a mainstream ideal. So how did American hardcore go from this West Coast suburbanite adolescent angst-ridden form of punk rock to this hyper-masculine, somewhat violent, almost gang-like form of New York hardcore? Well, it's all to do with a band called the Bad Brains. So the Bad Brains were a band that were part of the Washington DC scene. They were infamously banned for violence at the shows, which is infamous due to the fact that many consider it to be a band based on discrimination, considering that the Bad Brains were a group of African-American Rastafarians. Every single band, as part of the Washington DC scene, had violence both on and off the stage, so their ban was always viewed as somewhat suspicious. During the time before they were banned from Washington DC, that they were playing shows in DC, serendipitously, a young John Joseph, who would one day actually form the Cro-Mags, who is one of the main songwriters on The Age of Quarrel, which is one of the albums which we're particularly putting a spotlight on here. He fled the Navy, or actually was kicked out of the Navy for fighting, getting into too many fights, and he caught a Bad Brains show. He was bowled over by it, both musically and on stage. They are absolutely electric. They have aspects of punk rock, they have aspects of reggae, but they are genre defying. They are all over the place, essentially, but in the best possible way. After the ban from Washington, D.C., the Bad Brains needed a place to go to. John Joseph also decided that he was going to relocate back to New York. So the two end up having a positive effect on one another in terms of bringing the Bad Brains over to New York, and the Bad Brains becoming the archetype for New York hardcore and for these bands to kind of build from. Young bands like Agnostic Front, the Cro-Mags as they come to be, Kraut, would start to play shows, and a lot of that early music of the early New York hardcore scene was very much informed by the visceral insanity of the Bad Brains. Converse to this is the development of hip-hop, which is actually far more codified and far less nebulous than the development of American hardcore. This can be pointed back to one singular day, August 11th, 1973, at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue. So Sedgwick Avenue was one of, as is known, the projects. So the projects being community housing. Back in the early 70s, there was the South Bronx Expressway, which was developed, which essentially caused what is known as white flight, where the affluent white community that lived there before didn't want to live near an expressway, so they moved away, which basically meant that there was land to be developed and community housing to be raised, which went predominantly to immigrant communities, African Americans, Caribbean immigrants specifically. One of these Caribbean immigrants being an individual called DJ Kool Herc, who used to throw block parties, such as the one at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue. In this party, he took a turntable. He took two versions of exactly the same record so that he could basically loop particular sections of the record indefinitely, and he threw a tremendous party, which is known as the genesis of what hip-hop is. DJ Kool Herc used to have a friend called Coke La Rock, who also spat one of the first lines, one of the first bars, rapping at one of these block parties. So he was incredibly important to the actual foundations of hip-hop and what that meant. American hardcore experienced its transition from the West Coast suburbanite hardcore through to New York hardcore entirely in an underground capacity. Hip-hop, however, had a very different form of ascension, so they did go toward the mainstream. After the three founding fathers of hip-hop had set the stage for some of the ethical, social, and musical ideas of what hip-hop are, those founding fathers being Afrika Bambaataa, the Grandmaster Flash, and DJ Kool Herc, hip-hop went to the mainstream, but very much in a sanitized, pop-like capacity. So artists such as the Sugar Hill Gang releasing tunes like Rapper's Delight during that kind of mid-70s period was essentially how hip-hop was viewed through the mainstream eyes. A little bit goofy, a little bit silly. Yes, they did talk about real things, but it was predominantly themes of excess, this kind of thing, monetary excess. This would all change through The Message by Grandmaster Flash, which dealt with far more savage and street level ideals. So dealt with things like drug dealing, dealt with suicide, dealt with violence, dealt with racism and bigotry, essentially things that would come to define the voice of hip hop through the next 20 or so years. The Message was that genesis point, and as such is considered as one of, if not the most important track to the development of hip-hop as a social ideal and as a social vehicle for change. One of the unique commonalities between New York hip-hop and New York hardcore, especially when compared to its West Coast equivalent, is the fact that many of the lyrical themes actually cross over, and we can use this ideal to glean information about the way that these communities specifically react to these ideas. So ideas of poverty, ideas of violence, drug dealing, many, if not all of these things cross over. There are, of course, themes that are specific to the each genre in question. So, for example, with hip hop, racism, bigotry is a much larger topic than it would be in hardcore. Politics is often mentioned more directly in hardcore. However, it's mentioned in quite a broad stroke sort of manner. They don't tend to speak about specific politicians very much. They don't tend to speak about specific political situations, just that there is, quote, corruption, and that they are aware that something has failed them, and that is coming from levels of higher power. In hip-hop, however, even though politics, they don't tend to be mentioned quite so directly, they are mentioned through the themes of the stories being told. So let's take the ideal of poverty, which is experienced by both the New York hip-hop and the New York hardcore communities, and let's see how the Cro-Mags and Nas relate to poverty in completely different ways and what that says about the communities that practice them. Starting off with the Cro-Mags, we have lyrics such as, living in burnt out buildings, living in the streets, it's the life of the Cro-Mags. Living in enclosed walls, got no money in my pockets, no pictures on the walls. Fighting is such a struggle and I got so far, I ain't got nothing. This ideal of struggles and fighting come hand in hand with much of the lyrical content of the Age of Quarrel. There is an implicit idea that they know that they have been failed. There is an implicit idea that they have the internal power, if they can find the truth of the situation, to work their way through. There is individual power that they possess. And this comes up all the time. Fight, struggle, overcome. These are the kind of lyrical ideals that the Cro-Mags deal with. And it is impossible to look at that approach to poverty and struggle and not understand that there is some white male privilege inside of that, because they do understand that there is some inherent power in their version of the self. This is vastly contrasted to the way that the hip-hop community and Nas deals with the idea of poverty. My window faces shootouts, drug overdoses. The streets is filled with undercovers, homicide chasing brothers. I'm trying to get this money, God. You know the hard times, kid. Shit, cold be starving, make you want to do crimes, kid. Life's a bitch and then you die. That's why we get high. This perfectly demonstrates Nas's approach to poverty. There is no ideal that you as an individual can overcome this. This is systemic poverty. This is poverty that in many cases with hip-hop is based on bigotry, police brutality, a lack of faith in the justice system. And we find here that Nas simply speaks of the truth of how poverty affects him and those around him in the streets. The only way that the immigrant communities of New York were going to get any form of power or any form of equal representation was not due to individual power, because they don't have any. They speak about the power of the community, such as the Zulu Nation from Africa Bambaataa. The only way that there's going to be any representation for those communities is to band together and have their own smaller societal power within their own worlds. And Nas does tend to speak about that quite a lot, that the hood is almost its own world, its own environment with its own laws and its own punishments and ideas. It's hard not to look at the musical content of New York hip-hop and New York hardcore and not see that there are similarities of this idea that on the surface the genres seem very different, but deeper underneath there are distinct similarities that connect the genres together. The differences are very, very obvious. One is electronic, one is fundamentally rock music, one samples its musical content from, generally speaking, African American music, so jazz and funk and soul, and one is inherently building upon rock and punk music of the past, although it's worth mentioning that that, of course, also comes from African American music such as the blues. Deeper underneath the surface, however, we do have certain distinctive similarities between the music. The idea that structurally, as both genres developed, they were not natural, usual song structures. Hip-hop initially, due to the fact that it was essentially just loop beats, would be a series of verses with just the occasional hook, and that ideal of linear, non-standard song structure would continue through hip-hop's development. On Illmatic, there is a fair share of the beat just running, and Nas just on verse after verse after verse. In New York hip-hop, we have very non-standard song structures. Much of the time, short songs, Structures with little repetition, structures with non-standard choruses that are almost always, or certainly in early New York hardcore, would be simple rallying cries. So structurally, we have a subversion to the norm. We have the idea that both genres are interested in kind of trimming the fat and trimming the superficiality out of it and speaking a truth, an inherent truth that demonstrates the lives of the communities that practice them. And this allows you to actually understand that the individuals practicing the genres, and Nas or indeed John Joseph or Harley Flanagan from the Cro-Mags, are living this life and it is authentic. That authenticity is something that is highly sought after in both genres, and the fans of those genres are looking actively for that authenticity. Inherently then, what do we actually take from this musical and lyrical analysis of The Age of Quarrel and Illmatic? And we take the idea that where groups can experience similar things, every single group and facet of society has to react to those things in a different way. So be it the idea of the justice system, be it the idea of politics, be it the idea of drugs, be it the idea of violence, be it the idea of anything that affects society as a whole, every community has to deal with it differently, and that is demonstrated in a great way when both communities are in the thrall of that struggle, as they are in hip-hop and hardcore in New York. We also take from it, however, that inherently people are experiencing the same things, and it shows that the society around them could be classed as maybe inherently broken, maybe inherently cruel, and that we have to all languish underneath these ideas, and that nobody really stands unaffected. We're lucky if we're unaffected. It's not that there is any inherent deficiency in those who are failed by the system. It's that we are lucky if we are not failed by the system, if we happen to be privileged enough to not fail by the system. We also take from it the idea that both genres musically, although they come from a similar place of African American music, have veered off in greatly different directions. One is building upon a Western ideal of rock and roll. One is building upon classic African American music forms, but both are using those musical platforms to speak the truths that are relevant to them. I think it's fair to say that hip hop and hardcore, I think on a deeper level, are more similar than they are different. But of course on a superficial level would appear to be the opposite way around. But I think it's more important when we're looking at these genres to look to the deeper level and the deeper truths of what's being said and what's being stated, the context, historical context around them. And we can certainly see that the communities are both grassroots and are practicing in such a way that they are speaking the truth that's relevant to them.